All right, so now that we've got our HDA, one of the first things we're going to be doing on this is this whole kind of setting a test project, right? But this list was populated by us manually. We just filled in that string menu. Instead, we need some the menu to read from somewhere, right? Now, that where it's reading from somewhere, one of the best ways to do that is with an actual config file, right? So we're going to use just a JSON file where we store that information, because I've done it before where you try to create your kind of your pipeline based on folder structure. You use the name of the folder as the project name and that type of stuff, but that can be quite messy. It's very sort of archaic and cumbersome. It can work at first in a very simple pipeline, but later on it gets just slower, just worse to work with. It allows for a lot of human error. So we're going to use a config file, right? And we've already spoken about JSON and also using OS and stuff like that. So we're fully geared up to create a config file where we can store this information. Now, we want to be able to select from a list of projects that already exist. And if one is created for us, like added to that config file, we want to, as we click this menu, for that to appear in here, brand new, okay? So every time we click this and run and look at this menu, we want it to be checking for a new list, right? We also then want the ability to click this plus and add a project to that list. And you saw before it pops up a menu asking us a bit of information, because of course we need to define that information. There's no way to know that procedurally. We have to tell it what the project name is that we want, what the project code is, and the FPS of that project, right? But we should only have to set that up once. And then we need to be able to remove projects as well. Okay, so we're going to start with this. Now, I want to just show you, so remember here, this path, right, is my path to my global repository, okay? And when working with something like config files, especially that go across all the projects, of course I'm going to want to work in my global area. I have a folder called config, and inside of here I will store all my config files. So we're going to create one here. Now what I've done, in case you're wondering what this is, I've created an archive folder where I have stored all of my scripts that I obviously created before in preparation for this course. So you'll see under scripts I have all of my scripts that I've already built just stored in our archive. Okay, so in case you were just wondering what this archive folder is, because I'm going to jump in and show you what this actually looks like to show you the result of what we want to get to, but then I'm going to show you how to create this through Python. Okay, so I'm going to open this up, and as I said before, my JSON files are set to open in PyCharm, right? So let's pull this in over here and just show you kind of what we're after. Very, very simple, nothing you haven't seen before. It's just a dictionary, okay, so JSON dictionary, and one level in. So instead of having a list of projects where project name is one of the keys in the dictionary, instead I decided to go with the route here of using the key is the project name, and then the value is a dictionary which has all of the other data that we have defined about this, right? So one is the code, one is the FPS, and remember, although that pop-up dialog that we did in the demo of the tool didn't ask for the path when we in that one single pop-up, but it did pop up before asking to define the path. So we're essentially storing path, FPS, and code inside of the key, which is the name of the project. And this gives us an easy way of sort of referring to all of the data through just the project name. Okay, there are a lot of ways to do this, and your pipeline may be different, so feel free to obviously restructure this when you followed this course all the way through, because I don't imagine that any of you are going to want to use this exactly as is, but more as a base, but then to redefine it the way that works for you. Okay, so this is what we're after. we want to be able to, I mean, you see here, we did that new test, right? So when we created it, we defined the name and we just literally added it into this dictionary. And if we clicked remove, it would remove it from this dictionary. Okay. And as I said before, with config files, we can come in here and set this manually. So we could go and set this to something, I mean, absolutely bizarre, like 21 FPS or whatever, if we wanted to. Okay. So this is what we're going to be trying to recreate. So I'm going to close that down for now. So, and that's where I've got it temporarily stored, but really what we're going to do is here directly in config, this is where we're wanting it to be stored, okay? And I'm just calling it projlist.json, okay? So now we can go and create that file, right? We don't have to go and specifically rely on our script to create it, because this is one global config file. So we really don't need to do it through, through code or whatever. Why not just go and manually create it, okay? So you can create just a new text document, but as long as you name it with .json, then it will pick up as a JSON file, right? So we're just calling it projlist.json, okay? And there we go. It will now pick up and read through PyCharm, and we double click on this and it's going to open up, and you'll see, I mean, obviously it's going to be empty, but we at least know, okay, this is where we're planning on storing our data, okay? So there we go. So now we've got a nice empty one. All right. So that's how, like, we've created our config file, but we obviously want to populate that config file with a script. So in a similar fashion, like I say, I've put my scripts in an archive folder, because we don't want these to interact with, because it's the same as with the HDAs. The problem is that there's already a script called that, and I don't want to sort of, I want to be able to show you and refer to the way that the script is in its final form, but also go back and, so we've essentially pushed them off into an archive, which means that if I try and call those scripts, they will not be found, but we can go and open them up and kind of grab stuff from them if we want. If we go wrong somewhere, we can, go and check where we've gone wrong. But ultimately, we're going to be building our scripts in here, okay? So in order to create a script, right? So the way that Python works with these scripts is, if we create a script and we have to essentially call it with the module, right? So when you go import, okay, this is basically what we want to do, is be able to say import and then call our script name, okay? But so our script would, let's say, be called scene data, because that totally makes sense. This is our scene data node, so why not call our main script that has all of the scripts that go along with this, just call it scene data, okay? So that's what we want to do, is we want to be able to say import scene data and hit enter, and then obviously without an error, we want to then be able to say then, okay, so scene data dot, and then run whatever functions within that, okay? Now, in order for that to happen, we need to create a folder for that script to be stored in. But if we want the folder to be detected, the folder name to be detected as the name of the module, not the actual file, then we have to do something a bit special. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. Now, actually, I'm going to back up a second. We're not going to be creating the scene data node script first. I just want to show you one quick thing and explain my reasoning behind this. The actual scripts that are running based on this HDA should of course be included in a module called scene data. But this top section where we're running scripts to create and remove and set projects is in its own module called, I think I called it project tools, okay? Now, the reason I separated this is because we also want to, it's just a convenience thing that on our scene data, we actually have some of the tools that can control the projects, creating them, removing them, maybe altering them, like maybe later on you want to change the FPS for a project without having to recreate it, okay? So we can build a bunch of project tools, but it's just for convenience that the buttons that run those are included on the scene data node. Really, they are not intrinsically part of the scene data node. The scene data tool, this tool, just relies on this drop-down list and a list of scenes, and then of course, you know, all of the variables. We will want a tool in our Rebelway shelf, right, where we can manage our projects. And so because we essentially want to be able to manage projects through a shelf tool and maybe through other, there might even be other pipeline tools, HDAs, that also have the ability to add and remove projects. So they are all calling one global module that has to do with projects, and it is not specific to the scene data module. Okay, so this is why I'm going to be creating a separate, we're going to have one script for the project tools, the ability to create and remove projects and alter them. And then we're going to have a separate thing, which is the scene data, which will have all the scripts that set variables for us, because that is unique to the scene data node itself. Okay. Now, if I go and create a folder here and call this project tools, right? And inside of that, I create a script. So we can just go under new, we can create a text document, and then you can literally just create a script, right? Now, we can create something here, so project tools.py, right? We can do it this way. And then we would obviously have to include, because right now our scripts folder, so this path all the way up to here, is being included in our sys.path. Okay, so this is where it's looking for scripts, but we would have to go and include this folder then to look inside that folder and say, okay, well, you know, find this Python script. Okay, and then we would call it by its name. So we'd be able to say import project tools, spelt exactly that way, and then it would load it. Okay, but sometimes you want multiple scripts within one package. Okay, you might have sort of sub scripts or utility scripts or things like that, and you also have an initializing script. When that module is called, you want sort of some things to be run or set in the background. Okay, so we need multiple scripts in here, and this is where the kind of the problem comes in calling your script just the name of the module, right? So what we need to do is actually call this main.py, which is the kind of the convention, right? Obviously some places do it a little bit different, or some people work a bit different, but the convention is to say, call this your main script, main.py, so that we can have other scripts, and then it kind of makes sense, right? But the problem here now is that, well, we have to say import main, okay, not import project tools. And if we had another one, so for example, with our scene data, when we create our scene data one, right, we would also then have to have main.py, okay? So main.py, and how do we now differentiate between these two? Okay, so, well, I'm going to delete this one over here so we don't get ahead of ourselves, but this is the main thing that we're going, like the way that we're going to work with these. We want to tell Python the folder name is the module name. So first of all, I do not have to now manually add project tools into my sys.path, because this is still the root path where I want you to look for scripts. But I want you to treat this folder as the script. This folder is the module, and then inside of that there is just a subscript which is part of that module. Okay, and sure, I can import the main module from the project tools module, or I can import any of the other sub modules that I create, but this folder is the actual module, the main module. Okay, well, not the main module, but like the parent module. Okay, so how we do that is we create another script called, now it must be specifically named this way, right? __ init __ .py, okay, not .txt, right? Obviously, you can do this through PyCharm as well. If you set a project folder in there, then you can actually through PyCharm can right-click and say add script, and you can add a Python script, and you don't have to manually name it. But I mean, you know, it's so easy to create scripts here just through text documents. Now, if we have an init.py module, like a script in a folder, then Python treats that folder as the module, and then all of the other scripts inside of here as submodules. And this module, well, this script over here, we can fill it with something, whatever script we want. And when we say import project tools, it is going to run whatever is inside of this script first. Okay. It will obviously allow us access to what's in this script, but it runs this on import. Okay. So we can double click on here. Let's open this up in PyCharm, right? Okay, let's just let that load. Right. Now, in fact, what we're going to do, let's not do it this way. Let's actually say open. So we're gonna add a new project, right? But we're just going to navigate to one that is already there. Okay. So where was this all? Let's just go here. Okay. So I'm going to point to my project tools as an actual project. Okay. And then we'll say, well, let's open it up in this window. So now it picks up that project tools folder as a project, and we now have our two scripts inside of there, and we can switch between both and work with both in PyCharm right here. Okay, so this is how we're going to do it. Now in our init.py, let's just say print importing the project tools module or something like that. Okay, so we can create something in here so that when we import it, it actually is going to do whatever we say here. So it's just going to print something. This is a way for us to test it. And then in main.py, we can define something. So let's create a function, okay? A function for this module. So we'll just say, we'll just call it test, or test function. Let's be a bit more specific, okay? So test function takes no arguments, and it prints the word. Well, it prints this is a test function. Okay. So we have that in our main py, and then init has this. Okay. So this is how we set up a project folder. Also, when we make it an actual project folder in PyCharm, PyCharm's going to create this .idea folder, okay, with a bunch of other things that it needs. Okay, so if you see that pop up, don't worry about it, but also don't delete it. Okay, so that's our project folder, right? And in fact, I think that if we go open, yeah, you'll see it create the icon here changes a little bit. It shows you which ones are actually set up as proper PyCharm like projects. Okay, so you'll see all my other scripts in the archive also have that because they also have the same idea folder. Okay. So now that we have this, so in here we should be able to now say import project tools, right? And you see it ran that, so it printed the words importing the project module, project tools module. Okay, so when we imported it, not only did it not error, but it actually did something first on import, and now we can say. Because we imported it, but we didn't give it an alias, it is still called project tools like this. So we say project tools dot, and then do we call it test function? Okay. Did we not call it test function like that? Yes. Interesting. Oh, sorry, my bad. Getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So you see, this what we would have to do is actually do project tools dot main dot test function, because we're having to point to that sub module before then running the function. Okay, but so we would essentially have to say from project tools import main. Okay, so we have to actually import that module, but you don't want to import main just as main because that's very nondescript. So then we go and call it something like, we'll just call it proj or something. Okay, so it's kind of a way of giving it the same name as this, but maybe just a shorter one because we want to refer to it. But we're importing the main module from this primary sort of parent module, and we're giving it an alias. Okay, so this is how we would do that. Okay, and now when we say proj, we do proj dot, and then you'll see it even appears in here, our test function. Okay, and then when we run that, it prints this as a test function. Okay, so we've gone and created a project tools folder, and by creating an init.py, it treats that as the module, and then from that module we can go inside of that and import our main module but give it an alias. This method over here, what we just did, so from the module import main as alias, is what we're going to be doing most of the time, so that we can kind of keep everything nice and neat, and we're able to just access everything inside of our scripts folder nice and easily. Okay, right. So if we had other modules in here, we would then say from project tools import, my other module as, and then give it a different alias. Okay. Right, so that's the method we're going to be using. So make sure that you've done exactly this. You should have, in your scripts folder, you should have a project tools, and this should all be working, and you should be able to get all of this. If we're at that, then we're going to move on to actually building the first parts of this, this main module. Okay, so now that it's running this way, and we can run it through this, as we build functions in here, I mean, we know that this test function is already working, so if we build another function here, it stands to reason that it's going to do stuff. It's going to do whatever we filled in over here. So now we're going to create our first parts of the project tools module, the ability to actually add a project to our config file. Now we're not going to initially add it to our plus button. Buttons come later. Like attaching things to buttons is a much later process, right? We know that's where we're headed, which is why we started from the user end. But now we're going to build up the function, make sure that it works, and we can just run it in our Python shell. And when it is functioning, then we just attach it to that button, because we're also going to attach it to other buttons like our manage projects. When we click this, okay, the module is broken because it's been archived, but when we click that button, it would actually pop up saying, do you want to add a project, do you want to remove one? And then if we click add, it's going to run that function as well. Okay, so once we build the function, we can go ahead and attach it wherever we want. Okay, right, so let's move on to doing that. Okay, so in order to figure out where we're going to start, we're going to jump back in and have a look at the tool quickly. All right, now if we take a look at this, and if you remember when we did this sort of demo of how the tool is supposed to work, there were two dialogues. Okay, so one that had a user interface that was expecting us, the user, to navigate to a particular path, and that was essentially setting the project path, the main parent path where all of the other paths go. And so we essentially build a folder structure from that folder downwards. And then the second user interface, which had a sort of a multi-input, right? So the user was expected to fill in 3 bits of information, which were exactly these 3: the project name, the project code, and then the FPS. Okay. So step 1 for our tool is to basically ask the user that information. So we're going to build those user interfaces, and then we're going to store all of that information. And that information is essentially what goes in our config file, especially because the rest of it can kind of be inferred. Well, at least the scene path and HDA path or whatever is all just a subpath of the project path. So we can infer the rest. All right. So let's jump over to PyCharm over here, where we're going to start building our function. So we know that we have a test function over here, so we've already tested that we can access that from Houdini just by importing our main module. So we're going to define a function in here, and obviously we'll then be able to call that in Houdini. So our function is going to be called addProj, because that's exactly what we're doing. So we're adding a project. And let's begin with the user interface. So we've already done the who.ui. Okay, so we're going to say who.ui and now the particular type that we're after over here, if you remember from our UI lesson, is select file. Okay, so that's going to allow us to navigate on disk, right? And there are several arguments. A lot of them are all optional. They have defaults. Okay, But what we're really after here is just to be able to give it a title, because we want to essentially tell the user what that dialog is for, so what they are intended to do. And then the file type, because we want them to navigate specifically to a folder, so a directory. Okay, and if we pop open the help file for that, so we go to our who.ui and then go to this module, we'll be able to see the arguments, right, under select file. Title over there, it has a default, but we're going to be replacing that. And then the file type has a who.file type, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, there is a .directory. Okay, so this is what we're after. Okay, so those are the two bits of information that we're going to feed it. Okay, so in here we can always test it in here if you want to. So we can say, okay, title equals, and then we'll give it some title, and then file type equals, and then it's who.file type .directory. Okay, so when that pops up, it now navigates to an actual folder, and it has our title at the top there, right? And when we select a folder and say accept, you'll see what it returns is a path to that folder. Conversely, if we just cancel, you see that it returns an empty string. It does not return, it does not have a tuple here that tells us which button was pressed, but rather if it's empty, it means that it was cancelled. All right. Because if we try and accept with nothing selected, if we try and accept, it will not let us get past this dialog. So we know that if it's empty, it has been cancelled. And it's important to note that, because we obviously need to account for that in our script. Okay. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to build this. So who.ui.select file title equals, and then we're going to give it a title. So let's be explicit with this. So we're going to tell the user select project directory. Okay, so we're asking the user to select a project directory, and then file underscore type equals who.file type directory. Okay, now we obviously want to store this, but you know, we can always just, I mean, we can even just print this or whatever, just because at first we want to check whether this actually works. Okay, so we're going to print this, and now we're going to try and run this function from Houdini and see what happens. Okay, so we'll close that dialog. Now we have already imported our main. All right, we can double check that, so we can say from project tools import main as proj. Okay, so remember we've done that, right? So proj is our module. But if we've made any changes to it, these changes will not take place unless we reload. So there is a reload function, and we can reload the project module, and so it will accept any changes that have happened. And that's an important part to know, because in our Python script, whenever a button is pressed, we're actually going to force reload, just in case anything has changed in the script. Every time we click the button, we want it to actually take the updated changes. So we will be reloading before actually running any functions. Okay. And now on proj, when we hit dot, you'll see that there is actually a bunch of functions here that we can run. Okay. So there's test function and the project. Okay. Sorry, the add project. Right. So when we run our add proj, let's see what happens here. Okay. So there we go, and that pops open. Okay. Now, if we go back to our script over here, you're going to see that actually the who module over here is broken. Now, of course, PyCharm does not really know what the who module is, but it will kind of complain sometimes that we haven't imported it here. So sometimes we will be expected to actually import it here. So I always just put it at the top. Even though here this line doesn't actually know what we're trying to import, but at least these lines will not complain when we call the Houdini module, because at least it knows what we're referring to. And then when we run it in Houdini, of course Houdini knows what the who module is, so it will run with no errors. Okay, right. So we're here. We're going to ask to navigate to a project directory, and then we're going to store this. Now I want to I'm going to store this in a temporary path. Okay. What I'm trying to do is fill in the actual a variable called path, but what I'm going to do is temporarily store it in, and so I use an underscore here to store a sort of a temporary version, something that I'm not going to export. Okay, so I'm not going to use path except to just temporarily hold that value for me. And the reason I'm doing this is because I basically want to set path to be equal to, and then just as almost a caution, I guess, is remember in the OS module there is an os.path.dir name. Okay, this is the function that returns the directory name of the path that we give it. Okay, so it's going to essentially, if they are, even though we've told it here we specifically are looking for a file type directory, if Houdini bugs out in any way and it has somehow enabled them to select a file instead of a folder, then using the os.path.dir name will essentially grab the folder instead of the file. Okay, it's because it separates the actual, let's say we have a path, so it's, I don't know, C:, and slash, and then we have some folders, and then we have a file, so dot, whatever, txt, or it doesn't matter what. If we ran dir name, it would separate this over here, so it would get rid of that, and it would separate these into two different strings. So that's the file, and then this is the directory name. Okay, so that's what dir name is doing, so we're going to do that. Obviously, we need to import the OS module in order for this to be happy. And so this is just a caution to make sure that we're grabbing nothing but the directory. Okay, and that's where I'm then now storing it in the path directory. Okay, and then if we want to be certain, we can print path, right? So we can double check that, but really in here we're going to need to say reload proj, and then we can do proj.add proj, and then it'll allow us to go and select a file. Okay, and okay, hang on. Oh yes, sorry, we haven't given the module for the dir name. We have to actually feed it path, so we're going to feed it underscore path over here so that it will convert that. So it takes that path and grabs the directory name from it. Okay, let's come back in here, let's reload again and add path, and it should be fine. So we can accept that, and there we are. Okay, so that's the first part of the dialog done, right? Now, we do want to do some checks on the path that they give us. One of the things being that, what if they've given us a path that we already have used as a project path? We don't want multiple projects to be able to be stored in the same folder. That's just asking for trouble. So we're going to do that, but I'm going to return to that a little bit later once we've actually been able to write data to our config file, because in order to check whether the project exists or not, we need to check the data in our config file. So we're going to actually come back to that later on. Okay, so let's move on. So the one thing that I pointed out was that if they cancel, then path will be an empty string. So we're just going to build in a quick statement for that. So we're going to say if path equals, and then we'll just give it an empty string. Then we're going to do something here. Now we're inside of a function, so obviously we can just return from that function, because then it's going to return nothing and it's not going to continue running the script. Okay. Now, one thing that I want to do is, okay, so the next part is we're essentially going to be popping up a dialog and asking for a multiple input from the user, right? So let's come back to Houdini and double check our who.ui. And then there is a multi-input. I think it is read multi-input. Okay, so that's the function that we're wanting, right? So let's go and have a look at it in the help file, because it's just a little easier to read than in here. So let's go who.ui. Okay, and then read multi-input. Now it wants a message to explain what the input actually is, and it obviously wants the input labels, and those have no defaults because it must have those two. It has no way of knowing, right? And then buttons, it's got one button, but obviously we always want the ability to cancel, so we're going to alter that. But then something else as well is we want to have some initial contents. Okay, this over here, initial contents, because we already know what the project folder name is because they've navigated to a folder. So it's nicer to try and assist the user. So we're going to give them the name of that folder as the initial contents for the project name. They may or may not use it, but it's nice to at least kind of guide them. The code we really have no way of knowing, so we'll leave that blank. But then also FPS, we're going to make a suggestion over here at maybe 25. Okay, so the kind of the most common project like FPS would be probably 25, although if you find you're always using 30 or something, then just set that to be your default. But it's nice to sort of give them a choice, or like a default value already, and then they can override it with a different one. But you know, it kind of, what it does is it guides them and shows them what they should be entering over there. Okay, so we need to give it a message, input labels, buttons, and then initial contents. Okay, so let's go and do that. So we'll go back to our script. So, right, so we're going to do who.ui.read multi input, and then message equals, and then we give it our message, right? So we're just going to ask them to enter the, I guess we could call this the project data. So enter project data, okay? And then we have our project label, our input labels. I forget the exact wording of this. It was called, input underscore labels, right? That's our next keyword. So input labels. And then that is a tuple of strings. So now the first one we want is our project name, comma, then we want our project code, and then we want our FPS, or you could say project FPS, or whatever you want. Okay. Now we're going to continue giving arguments over here, but you see here we're getting to this line that PyCharm gives us. Now this is sort of all part of helping us format things correctly. It's going to make a lot of suggestions. You'll see all these little squiggly underlines as well. Like it suggests that there are 2 blank lines after every function. So if we go give it another line, then it will sort of not complain about that. It's trying to help us format things in a way that the script is easy to read. And so here, if we go over this edge, it's going to complain. So I'm going to keep typing, but you'll see it will complain. And what we're going to essentially do is enter and continue typing on the next line. Now the next argument we're going to talk about is buttons, which of course we do want okay. It's a perfectly acceptable button, but we just want to add the cancel button to that list. Okay. And then initial, I think it's initial underscore content is the other argument. And then what we need to do is give it a bunch of strings that are the same number of labels that we've given here, because remember, if we give 3 labels, it's going to create 3 inputs. We need to now give it a string for each one. Even if we're not going to give it one, then we give it an empty string. Okay, so what we need to do though is grab the actual project name from this path as the first argument here. Okay, so for now I'm just going to I'm going to put a placeholder, and I'm going to just call it proj name. Okay, so we're going to come back to that one in a second. The next one, remember our project code, we're just going to leave it blank, but our last one is 25. Okay, now it is not just 25 like this. It does not accept an integer or a float. It wants a string. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. We have to give it a string. Our user is going to type a string. It's going to return it as a string, and then in order to interpret it correctly, we're going to have to convert it. Okay. Now you'll see here it will complain essentially about this line, saying that we need to basically give a new line. It's too long, okay, too many characters. So over here, we can hit enter, and you'll see that it formats it this way, where it just pushes it to the next line. Okay, and then we also need a new line at the end of the code. Okay, so you see, there we go. PyCharm is helping us create correct formatting. All right, so this is what's going to pop up, and obviously we want to store this in some kind of variable. So let's just call it inputs. Okay, so this is what the user has input, and actually here we haven't. We now need to tab in the same amount. So I'm going to just go back here and then hit enter, so it lines up perfectly. Okay, so we've created a variable called inputs, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to print inputs, so we can see what comes out when the user inputs things. Okay, all right, so let's go there. I'm going to you can hit Control S, but PyCharm does have an auto save, and now we're going to come back in here and let's run this. Okay, so we reload proj, okay, and then we say proj dot add proj. When we run that, it lets us grab a folder. We say accept, okay. And then, okay, so we've got an error. Initial content is an invalid. Okay, so let's have a look. Oh, in initial contents. Okay, so you see why we do a lot of printing. We always want to check, because you don't want to get too far and then you've not actually filled it in correctly. Okay, so there we go, initial contents. Let's go back to Houdini. Try that again. So let's reload, then add proj. Navigate to a folder, so let's select that folder as an example. Okay, so it props up with a dialog, enter project data, gives us 3 things to enter. We can, now it's got just given proj name, but we're actually going to swap that for an expression, and then it lets us enter a code and an FPS. Okay, and if we say okay, it's going to return a tuple, which includes which button was pressed, so an index of which button was clicked, and then another tuple which contains strings for every input and what was given. Okay, but the problem is we don't want to allow there to be an empty string. We cannot allow there to be no code or no project name, because then it's very difficult to work with that when some have it and some do not. Okay, so, and then if we cancel, you'll see that it still returns what was in there, as well as then 1, because we clicked the button 1. Okay, so if they do click 1, then we'll allow them to cancel. But if they have not input a correct, if they've left something blank and have clicked 0, then we want it to actually tell them, hey, listen, you need to input some data, and we want to pop this dialog back up. Okay. And so that's something that we need to build in. Right. So let's pop back in over here. Now, first thing, let's swap this project name for an actual, for the actual name of the folder that we came from. All right. So we can do that in front over here. And what we're going to do is just, I'm going to create a temporary project name. Okay, so I'm going to call this proj name, but with an underscore in the front. The reason it's temporary is because this is not actually our project name. We're just assuming. We're just going to assume based on this path, but, well, this path. But then once we insert it over here, the user is going to correct us and give us the correct project name, and then we will set proj name. Okay, so here I'm just going to make an assumption, and how we can do that is we're going to take our path, right? And we're going to split it. But if we do an os.path.split function, this will take the path that we give it and will split just the end of it off. Okay, if you remember, we did that in our OS module, right? So it's not just a normal string split that's going to split it at every single slash. Instead, it's just going to take the last one off. All right. So if we feed this path, what it's going to return is then a tuple that has 2 things. One, which is the path except the last folder, and then the second index is the last folder. So we're just going to grab the -1 index from that list. Okay, so in other words, the last one. And then set that as a variable called proj name. So now what we're going to do in here for the initial contents is just feed it that variable. Okay, So let's go and have a look that this has worked. Okay, so let's reload. And then now we can go in. If we select working files, when we go OK, you'll see here that our project name defaults to working files. Right. I mean, that's obviously not what we want, but it at least is working in that whatever the user selected now ends up being the default of project name. Okay. Right. Now, once they have clicked cancel or OK, either way, we need to then assess what they've done. Right. So let's jump back in, and of course we want to take what the input that they've actually given us and sort of strip it apart. But first thing, if they have clicked cancel, we just want to return from this whole thing. So we don't want to really bother with what they typed or whether they did insert anything or not. We just want to say, well, if input, so inputs is our variable, so we'll grab our variable, but remember that's going to be a tuple. And the first index of that tuple is which button was pressed. So if inputs 0, and you can just leave it like this, because if it's either going to be 0 or 1. 0 means they clicked OK, 1 means they clicked cancel. So if they clicked cancel, it's going to execute this block because it'll be equal to 1. But we can be a little bit more, I guess, more explicit, just because maybe later we add another button. Okay. So we just want to say if inputs 0 equals 1, then what do we want to do? We want to return from this function. Okay, so that's if they clicked cancel. If they did not, then it will pass through this statement and we'll get to the next section. And in this next section, what we're going to do is we're going to extract the data that they just gave us. Okay, similar to here where we're setting path from what the user gave us, we're just going to be setting some information. So we're going to set the actual project name, not the underscore project name, not the temporary one, but the actual one, because the user gave us that name. Okay, so we're going to go inputs 1, which is our actual tuple of answers from the user, and which one? It's the 0. It's the first one in our list is project name. Second is project code, so we can just copy this and give that to project code. So we'll just call it proj code, and it's inputs 1, 1, and then again we've got proj fps, which is inputs 1, 2. Okay. Now, I just want to do one thing that's, I guess, a little bit pedantic here, but it's probably better practice. Whenever we're going to be sort of creating these variables that definitely have to have some kind of information filled in, and especially later as we build checks to confirm that what they've given us is actually correct. For example, now we're going to check whether the FPS is actually an integer. Did they give us a number, or did they type something weird in there? Okay. Now, in order to do that, you sometimes need to initialize the variables. Even if you're going to initialize them to none, that's okay. But if they are not initialized outside of any sort of if blocks or loops, then there's a chance that you'll come across a sort of an error within Python, which is going to say that you haven't initialized that variable. So, for example, let's say inside of this if, I created a variable. So I say foo equals 1. And now outside here, I print foo. Okay. It's not going to know what this foo is because even if we take away this return. Okay. So let's take away return. Okay. See, it's going to complain saying local variable foo might be referenced before assignment. Why is that? Because when it hits this point, if inputs 0 is 1, then it's going to set foo. So then we've got no problem. But what if inputs 0 does not equal 1? Well, then foo was never created. It was never initialized. There is nothing besides this line that creates foo, and so it has a problem with it. It sort of has a theoretical problem with it because it depends on what happens here, and that's not a good thing. Okay, so what we want to do to avoid this is we often, any very important variables, and especially ones that we're going to be checking inside of blocks, we go and initialize them. So I'm going to leave a comment over here. By the way, I like to divide up my sections of the code with actual comments so that we know what we're doing. Okay. So for example, here we could say something like we're asking the user to select project path. Okay. And then over here, we're saying select project name, code, and FPS, or something like that. Okay, just so that later on you know what's happening in each section. Okay. Now under init, what we're going to do is all of these variables that we're creating, we're just going to go and initialize. So for example, path, I just want to go and initialize it to none. Even though we're setting it here, I just want to make sure that it does exist. Okay, and then because it's set to none, what we can do is then later, if it has not gone through the correct process, we can check whether path is not none. Okay, so path is none. We're also then going to go and set project name, so all of these, right? So we can even copy this if we want to save some time. Go and swap this for none, none, and none. All right. So path, project name, project code, and project FPS. Okay. We might come back and add more later, but we're just initializing the variables over here that we may or may not have initialized correctly. Okay. So right. So now, sorry, let me just going to take a sip of water. Okay. So one thing we want to do once we've got these variables is to check that the user has not just left them blank. Okay. So we're going to say if proj name equals and then just a blank string, or because it matters if any of them are blank, so we can't afford to have any of them be blank. So we say project code equals that, or if project FPS equals a blank string. Okay, but what are we going to do if that is the case? We don't want to just return because we haven't really done anything. Like the user may have just made a mistake, and we need to teach them that you know, if they click cancel, that's a different thing. The user is saying, I want to cancel. I want to back out of this. Okay, but if they've just clicked OK, and we know they've clicked OK because if they click cancel, we would have exited already. Then we want to say to them, listen, you didn't fill in all the information. Okay. It's like if you had a form that you needed somebody to fill in and then you hand it to them, they give it back to you and they've left some of it blank, you would just give it back to them and say, do you mind filling in the rest, right? So that's what we want to do here. So what we're going to do is actually put this entire bit of code that we've been doing over here, we're going to put it into a loop. But that loop, we're only going to loop once unless the information that they give us is incorrect, in which case we're going to then loop again and loop again until they get it right. Okay. So how we create that is we're going to do a while loop. Okay, so while loops as long as a particular argument is true, right? So we're going to create a while, but I'm going to create a variable called repeat. So I'm saying while I have a repeat value of true, then loop this. Okay, and outside of this, just before we enter, I'm going to set the repeat value to be equal to true. Now, I need to be very careful with this because obviously if repeat is true and we enter a while, then it's just going to loop this infinitely. So immediately as we enter the loop, we say repeat equals false. So this is a bit strange if you just saw it, you know, on the face of it, because it's saying, yes, we're going to loop this thing, and in fact, technically, we're going to loop it infinitely. So it enters once to try and start looping infinitely, but then immediately changes itself to false. Now, it checks this value as it enters the loop. Okay, so at this time, it's true, so it says I'm going to execute this block. It executes the block. At the end of the block, it loops right back in and says, is repeat still true? But because we immediately set it to be false, after it's done once, it comes back here and it says, nope, I'm false. So I did that work once. I'm now going to exit this entire block and come to here. So that is what we want. We want it to happen once. But now if the user has given us anything that has blank strings, then we just say repeat equals true. So we set repeat to be equal to true, but obviously it's going to loop right back and immediately set itself to false. So every time it's attempting to not loop again, but only under very specific conditions inside of here are we setting it to true. Okay. And then also we can put continue, because if we do have more code after this point, well, it's kind of redundant. We don't want to actually process that code because we know at this point they've already messed up. Okay, they already haven't given us the information we need, so we need to at this point continue on to the next loop, which the next loop is actually gonna happen because we've set this to true. So we jump right back and loop. Okay, so if we just clicked continue but didn't set repeat to be equal to true, then it would just actually jump out of the loop because it's going to continue to the next loop, which, because it's false, is not going to happen at all. Okay. So that's how we essentially loop back. In fact, let's test this. Let's make sure that we get it right here. Okay. So I've saved. Let's jump back in here. Let's reload proj. And then we do add proj. We allow our user to select a folder. When we click that, it opens up a default. Now this one's blank, so let's just say OK and allow it to, and you see here, it just pops right back up. Every time I click OK, it will not allow it to disappear until we either click cancel, because of course cancel does not even allow us to enter that loop, or whenever we correctly enter a value. Now when we click OK, it's totally fine and it goes away because it's stored that value. Our code would just be equal to whatever we typed there. Okay. All right. Now another thing we need to check based on the data that we got from our user is the FPS. Okay, so technically we can accept anything as a project name and a project code. Okay. Obviously, there are some that are better than others, like, you want to keep your codes nice and short and succinct, but technically the user could put whatever they want. It doesn't really matter. They can use numbers and stuff because it's just a value. It's just a random string variable that we're using to tie things together. But the FPS has to be a number. We need to check that they haven't gone and done something like typed, we go and set this, and then they go and give us a project code, and then they say, I don't know what the FPS should be, and then they click OK. Well, we can't accept that, right? We don't know what they mean by that. They have to choose a number. So we're gonna check that. Okay. So one of the ways to check that is we want to take our FPS, right? And in fact, it's called proj FPS. Okay, so there it is, and you'll see PyCharm helps us fill it in. So as we start typing proj, it already knows which variables we have that are already set. So it's going to make suggestions to us. So we say proj FPS, okay? And we want to just convert this to an integer. So what we can do is just wrap this in an int function, okay? But what's going to happen if we try and int something that is not an int, okay? And you need to always know, because it's okay if it errors. That's not a problem. We just need to know that it's going to error. Or does it return a null value? Like, does it say none? We need to know which one, because we can work with either, but if we don't know which one, then we don't know what to do with it. So let's come and test it over here. Let's int, and then we feed it a string of 25. So we see that that does work, because you see there are no quotes on either side of this 25. Okay, but what if we go and try to int some text? So it throws back a traceback error, which has a type value error over here. So this is really important. So it doesn't just return nothing or return the original string or something like that. It literally errors out. And so we need to encase this in a try except block. Okay. So if you remember the duck typing that we spoke about, right? So we're going to try and convert this. But if it fails with specifically a value error, then we're going to do something else, okay? what, we're not sure yet, so I'm just going to put a pass there, but we're going to try and convert it. Now we want to store this in the FPS, so I'm going to actually just store it in proj FPS. We could actually do what we did before, where we go and put an underscore over here, and then over here we check with underscore proj FPS and underscore, and then we only store the final one once we've done the conversion. So you can do it this way around if you want to, or you can overwrite variables if you want to. Okay, you just convert it from one to the other. So it's up to you if you want to do this kind of formatting or not. Okay, so in this case, let's just go the other route, right? So we are storing proj FPS, but at this stage it's a string, and now we're converting it to an integer, overriding itself though, instead of a new variable. But if it value errors, it means that we've given it, a string which actually has text instead of numbers, and so what are we going to do about that? Okay, so essentially what we're going to do over here is, well, it's a similar thing to what we're doing here, is we're just going to loop back in. Okay, but we don't only want to just loop in. We kind of want to tell the user why, because it's a little bit confusing if we don't actually tell them why. In fact, technically we probably should tell them why here as well. So we need to kind of pop up some kind of message, or something like that, tell them what they're doing. And also, some kind of problem with just popping up any random message though is that what if that what if they don't have a terminal open, or what if they're not paying attention? So we kind of want to have not just a print something, just a print error, but actually pop up a who.ui display message error to tell them, hey, listen, you're kind of doing something wrong here, right? So we can do that, right? So in here, we would say something like, okay, well, so we can print, and we can say FPS not set to a number. So you tell them why it's erroring, and then say, please enter a whole number. Okay, sorry, not a capital there. Okay, so please enter a whole number, right? And in fact, you could even put this on 2 different lines if you want to, so that we can kind of keep it neater or whatever. So we would just make it 2 separate strings, and then we just push this to the next line. Well, actually, hang on, let's just do it this way. If we just hit enter, it'll just push it to the next line like that. Okay, so we're saying print this, right? We'll just take that away. But we also want to pop up with a message. So we want to say who.ui.display message, right? And then we want to give it that same message. So instead of just printing this as an error, what would be better is if we turn this into a variable. So we store this as a message. Okay, let me just let's just set this as 1 line for now. Well, it is 2 lines here in the actual thing, but we're just going to have the variable be 1 line. Okay, so we've got our message, and now what we do is we just print message, and then who.ui.display message, we feed it message as the text. Okay, and then there is just nothing but an OK. But what we can do in here is put the severity equals who.severity type, and then remember we have error, we have warning, so we could just pop up a warning because it's not really necessarily an error. Well, I don't know, actually I think it is an error because we can't function without it working this way, so it is more of an error than a warning. Okay, so we store one variable with a message, but then we both print it to the terminal and pop up the message. Printing, because it's a bit more permanent, once they click OK, the message goes away, but also the pop-up message is a little bit more obtrusive and they have to click OK, so they have to acknowledge that they've seen it, as opposed to this, they could have that hidden, and then they don't know why it's erroring. Okay, and same kind of vibe over here. We just want to do some kind of message, but obviously our message is different, so we would say something like please fill in all fields, something like that. Okay, please fill in all fields, and then it'll have an error. Okay, so let's double check this now. Right, so I save, it's coming back in here. Let's reload proj, and then we go add proj. Okay, we go and select a folder, and now let's click OK. It's going to pop up saying please fill in all fields. It prints it as well, and then we click OK, and it goes back in. So it's a little bit more explicit now about why it's erroring. And then we go, okay, cool. We'll fill in all the fields. We'll do that, and then here we're going to tell it that we want 25 FPS, right? And we click OK, and it says, "Whoa, hang on, that FPS is not a number. Please enter a whole number." Oh, okay, cool. And now we go back in, so we leave that as a number. All right, and now it accepts it. Okay, so there we are. We have a much more intelligent tool now. It's actually starting to sort of think for the user and double check what they're doing wrong and tells them so they can learn from it. All right. Now, we're not going to do it right this second, but we will do it in future. But I just want to point out this moment. You see here how I have two very identical functions except for just one different message. What ideally we should do whenever we come across things like this, especially something that's going to be used again and again and again. I mean, how many times do you think we're going to have to sort of print a message and throw up an error? Okay, it happens all the time, right? The user is going to make many mistakes, or at least we need to account for many mistakes. So this is going to happen all the time. But what we're going to do is actually build a function, a utility function in a separate module that we can use to essentially speed up our scripting. Because we don't want to have to type that function every single time. So we're going to create this utility function, and then we can just run our own utility error and just feed it the variable that is different, which is the message. And then it will do the rest for us. Okay. So but we'll get around to that. We're going to come back and replace these with utility errors later on. Okay. Or if you feel up for the challenge, you can always go and do that yourself if you want. Okay. Right, so this is the first part where we now have the user inputting certain information. We are actually going to come back to this section as well, and like I said, add some more detailed check of the path that they've given us, but that's based on the config file. So let's first get to the point where we're writing the data to the config file. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. Okay, so now we're going to be storing this data in our config file. Okay, but in order to do that, we need to read from the config file as well, right? We kind of need access to it. And don't forget that this module that we're building here is adding projects, which also includes knowing what's already in the project file, because, well, the config file, because we will need to check whether projects already exist or not. We need to write to it. We need to be able to remove projects. So we need to be reading from that config file all the time. And so I'm going to be actually reading from that config file in the sort of main body of this module instead of in each individual function. Okay, we can go and put it in each function if we want to, but we might as well go and put it in the global section. Or we could embed it in its own function if we wanted, and then just run it inside of each of these scripts so that it goes and sets that. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we can handle it, but you know, it's trial and error, or it's also personal preference. So what we need to do is first feed it a path to our config file, right? And I like to put that right at the top here in a big variable, because let's say we started on a new machine, or maybe altered the way that our pipeline works. Well, we can just go and on all our scripts just go and change the base location for something like where all of our configs are installed, and then it can go and search for it. Okay, so in this case, so remember here, this over here, this is the path to our project list JSON file, right? So we're going to let's just call this proj list over here, and we're just going to feed it a string which has a full path to that. Okay. Now we actually want to not have it with these backslashes, right? We want to use forward slashes. So we're going to go and replace those, but I'm going to show you kind of a cool way to do that, right? Because we also want to add the full path, right? So we want to actually add the file as well to the end of this. Okay. But we need it all to have consistent, you know, backslashes or forward slashes, right? So if we select this whole section, this whole area, right, then you can right click and go, it'll be Control R for replace, like a search and replace function basically. And this is really kind of an easy way to, within your selection, is to then say, okay, well, go and replace all backslashes with forward slashes. Okay. And we can even see it's going to do it exactly 6 times, and we can go forwards and backwards, so we can loop through them. Okay, so we don't want to do it to that one, so we can exclude that one, right? So we go and you see it's going to exclude that, so it's going to skip that. So it's going to do it to only those. So now we can say replace all, and it switches them all for forward slashes. So there we go. That's nice. Nice and easy. All right. So we want to open our JSON file, right? We want to load from it because remember, it's going to be in JSON formatting. We need to get it as a Python dictionary. From that Python dictionary, we're going to assess what's in it. It may be an empty dictionary. That's okay. At this case, at this stage, it is. But we need to know that it's empty. Then we're going to add to it. And then, later on when we're deleting stuff from it as well, we need to read it and delete stuff and then overwrite. Okay. So remember, we're going to start with our with. So we're going to say with open, and we're going to open up our project list. So that's the path to the actual file. And we're going to open it up as read. Okay. So, well, in the read mode as, let's say, file. Okay, and then in here we're just going to create a variable called data, where we're going to store the JSON data. Okay, so we're going to do JSON.load, and we feed it that file. Okay, now you'll see here JSON has not been initialized, so we need to go and create that. Okay, so we're going to say import JSON. Right, and now that'll be happy. Cool. Here you see it's complaining, saying that file shadows an inbuilt name file. So actually probably better to maybe replace this. Now I want to show you something else kind of cool in PyCharm, a way to replace all references. So let's say we were referring to this file variable several times. It would be a pain to have to go and rename it at every time. So when we left click on this, okay, it detects, you see it even highlights all the other uses of this variable. Okay. So it's referred to once, and until it was actually called, it will go, not in this case, but normally it'll go any variable that we haven't called, like here, project FPS is being stored, but it is not ever being used. So it's actually a redundant variable. Okay. You'll see there, it even says it's not in use. Okay. So it grays itself out until it gets called. Now, over here, this detects that there are multiple uses of this. Okay, so it's set here, but it's also called. If we right click and go to refractor, okay, refractor rename basically allows us to go and rename this variable, and it will rename it in every place. Okay, but it's not doing a search and replace, so it's not going to go and replace the word file every time it finds it. It's only going to replace it when it is an actual call to that variable. Okay. And we're going to go and replace that just with the word F, okay, like the letter F, right? And we can preview it, or we can just click refractor and it'll go and replace them all. Okay, so there we are. So now when we call data, we're calling our actual JSON, well, it's a Python dictionary that came from our JSON file. Okay. And remember, we need 2 lines before any function, so that's why that was complaining. All right. Okay, so now what we're going to do is go and write to our JSON file. Okay, so we're going to gather up all of this data that we've stored, so our variables, proj name, proj code, proj fps, okay, and then write that out into a dictionary. Okay, so we're going to say let's call it proj data, just to stick with the kind of shortening, right? And we're going to create the dictionary. Now, of course, the key to this dictionary is the project name. So we're not going to store that in our dictionary, but we are going to sort of add it in. So what we're doing now is we're creating the value, but we're not creating the key. Then when we write to the dictionary, we'll feed it the key and this dictionary as the value for it. Okay. Now you'll also see how PyCharm wants me to format this. When I create a dictionary and I just hit enter with my cursor in the middle there, it's going to push that to the next line to the same level as that and puts us tabbed one in. Okay, so this is what I was saying when we were typing our dictionaries, is it's kind of like PyCharm will then teach you the correct way to format it. Okay, and also you'll see PyCharm lets you actually collapse any blocks that you've created, so you can collapse that entire block into one thing if you want to sort of see, like for example, our whole while block can be collapsed and expanded. It's pretty cool. So anyway, here's our project data. So remember, in our config file, in our example, we had a bunch of, so the value is a dictionary, and the dictionary has a bunch of keys and values, the keys being some sort of just a label essentially for what the data actually is, and then the value is the data that we want to store. So for example, I'm going to put code in capitals like that as my key. I'm not actually going to use that, I'm just going to use that to refer to this data, which is we want to store our project code, so proj code. Okay, then remember comma, and then we're going to give it the path. Okay, so that's another thing that we asked our user to input. So we have a, oh no, so not called proj path, it was just called path. Okay, and then our FPS was the third thing. Okay, well, there are obviously 4 bits of data, the other is the project name, but we're going to do that as the key to this dictionary. Okay, so we're going to give it proj FPS, proj FPS. And that is now our complete dictionary. Now we want to store this dictionary with the key as the project name, and this dictionary is the value. Okay, so what we do is we say, remember we have our dictionary, which is called data. Okay, at the moment it's an empty dictionary, but that doesn't matter. We can write to it by giving it a key and a value. So we give it the key, and then we say equals, and then we store a value in that key. If that key did not already exist, it will create it. Okay, very similar to how we can add to a set or a list. Okay, so we are going to give it now proj name as the key, and then say equals, and then we're going to give it this proj data as the value. Okay, now just in case it has not been initialized properly, just in case somehow we had some error that we haven't foreseen here, remember we initialized our project name and code and FPS to none over here. If somehow they have not been correctly overwritten and we've reached this stage, we do not want to put bad data inside of our JSON file, our config file, right? So we're going to embed this in one final check, which is we're going to say if proj name, and we don't have to say anything other than that, because the thing is, if the project name has not been overwritten with some other data, then it will be equal to none. And with none, we can just do a simple if check, because if proj name, if the project name is none, then that will return false. Okay, so if proj name is none, it will return false, therefore everything inside this block will not happen. And so we check if proj name and proj code and proj FPS. Okay, So all in all, just checking that all three of those variables exist and have been overwritten to some other value other than none. Then go and write this data. But if somehow we've gotten to this point and it's still none, then something's gone wrong. And so we're going to cancel this, right? So this is being just very, very safe. Okay. So now we've written to that data, but that's just a Python dictionary. That is not our actual config file. We need to store that in our config file. So we're going to write this back out. All right. So first thing, let's just double check that we still have data to make sure that we haven't somehow deleted data or overwritten it with nothing. Okay. So again, we're going to say if data, because as long as it has some value in it, then it will be fine. Okay. And then we're going to do something very similar to what we've done at the top here with the with open. So we are going to say with, and then we're going to open our, remember our project list is the path to our JSON file. We're going to open it though with write mode, okay? It's because we're wanting to write to it now. Remember, it's not still open here because we did it inside of the with. When it opened it and stored it as data, it closed it afterwards. So it's no longer open. So we have to open it up again. And then we can store it in here as something. So just F or whatever. Okay. And then we say JSON.dump. Okay. And then we are dumping our data. So it's still called data. So we're just going to feed it data. And then the file. Okay, so the actual open file, so remember that is just F, okay? But then we do want this to be nice and readable, so we are going to give it an sort keys. So sort keys equals true, since it's just nicer to read it that way. And then we're also going to give it an indent, and remember I said always give it an indent of 4, but I mean you can give it whatever you want. Okay, so now we have essentially should have written to our JSON file. Okay, so let's check that this has worked now. Let's confirm that our JSON file is indeed still empty. Okay, so we click here, see it is empty, but it does exist in that location. Now let's go to Houdini and run that, run our thing. So we're gonna reload proj. Okay. Value error, no JSON object could be decoded. Right, well let's go and trace this back and figure out where this is going wrong. Okay. Oh right, hang on, there is no JSON file in here, so that the JSON data is because it's entirely empty. Okay, it has just absolutely nothing. Right, so let's just go and initialize our JSON file with a dictionary. Okay, so this should be enough. We can double check, but just literally giving it a dictionary should be enough, because then at least there is some data there. Okay, let's reload proj, and now go proj.add proj. We point to a folder, so let's actually go up and point to our new test. Okay, as a project. We don't want to call it for new test, we just want to call it new test, maybe like that with a space or something, and we're going to give it a code over there, and 25 FPS is fine. We click OK, and now when we come and view our project list, you'll see that it has written something in there. Okay, so it wasn't happy having an entirely empty JSON file, but as long as there was at least something, then it would write to it. Okay, but that's just because we are actually reading from it here first. So you could even just make sure, if you wanted to be very certain, then instead you would put this inside of a try except block. Okay, so you'd maybe do a try except. You do this, you try, and then except if you get, remember it was a value error, so we say if value error, then you'd say data equals, and then you just give it a blank dictionary, because here we still want to write to that dictionary anyway, and it doesn't matter that it's not a JSON file, we just need a Python dictionary. We're going to write to it here, and then when we store it in this file, well then that's totally fine with us. Okay. So actually this should correct it. Should we? Let's test that. Let's entirely clear this JSON file. So it should error again, except because of this, it will not. Okay, let's test that. So let's reload proj. Okay, seems fine so far. Proj dot add proj. Let's run that. We'll choose our new test. We'll leave it as that. It doesn't really matter at this point. We're going to click OK. So no errors so far. And then let's come and have a look. And there we are. Perfectly fine. Okay. So yeah, you can just add that in just in case, let's say, somebody clears a JSON file entirely. Okay. Right. So now that we have that data, the next step is to then go and also do our final check where when we add the project, we want to double check that our project does not already exist inside of our JSON file because we don't want to be able to have two projects that share a location. Right, so that is going to be what we do next.